so we can get started. Um, Hi everyone, my name is Devanshi Purohit. I am the co-chair of Committee on Resilient Environments at BSA, and I have my fellow co-chair Dave Hampton here as well. We are focused on resiliency topics, but more specifically on the ecological governance and the community aspects of resiliency as well, in addition to the build form itself. And today's event is we have our guest today, Chris Bush. He serves as the Assistant Deputy Director of Climate Change and Environmental Planning at BPDA, and he's been spearheading this latest update in terms of coastal flood resilience, which is the coastal flood resilience zoning overlay. He's going to present a brief presentation, and then there's going to be time to do a small discussion and a Q&A afterwards. Um, Chris will also tell you that this is a draft zoning, and there you have a comment period that goes on until this Friday, February 12th. So if you have questions and comments, feel free to add it in chat, but I would ask you to mute yourself until Chris has presented, and then we can take care of all the questions. There is a chat window that's open for everyone to just sort of send your comments or questions in. Um, and Also, just to note that this session is being recorded and will be posted afterwards on the BSA website. But without further ado, thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today. I know that this is a very important topic, and it's going to impact a lot of architecture community, but just the larger community in general. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Devanshi, and thanks everyone for taking time out of your evening. This evening, I wanted to just cover some of the background on the development of the flood resilient design overlay, as well as our coastal flood resilient design guidelines, which were issued back in 2019, since both of those really kind of work together. Also, I'll just go over a quick summary of those guidelines, and then just a general overview of the specific provisions of the zoning overlay. But to start, a lot of our resilience work that we've been conducting in BPDA have really been sourced through Climate Ready Boston, which serves as the citywide resilience and preparedness plan. Really helped to define the primary climate hazards that we're going to be dealing with over time. I think most folks are familiar with these, but increased heat and heat island impacts, increase in precipitation and stormwater flooding, as well as increases in sea level rise and coastal storms and coastal flood events. Very important aspect of Climate Ready was the integrated vulnerability assessment. Through this, we learned that some of the most impactful climate hazards are going to be associated with coastal flooding and sea level rise. By 2030, we're expecting around 9 inches of sea level rise with fairly substantial impacts on residents and buildings. Potentially around 10% of the city could be inundated with a major storm event. And then really exponentially increasing by 2070 and beyond. We're expecting around 40 inches of sea level rise by then. Potential economic losses from a single major storm event could be upwards of $15 billion. Another important component of Climate Ready is the Resilience Initiative section, which gets into the types of policies, standards that the city needs to be developing to reduce vulnerability and risk to those hazards. Through this, we learned that over 75% of economic losses are going to be associated with structural damage, content loss, displacement. So one of the primary scales of resilience we've been working at is adapted buildings. Since the BPDA administers city planning as well as development and design review, we also are involved with zoning policy. We've really been on point for advancing resilient building solutions. So to date, we've got a smart utilities policy, which looks at enhancing resilience when it comes to utilities and infrastructure. We've updated Article 37 of our green building zoning and the resilience checklist that's embodied in that. Also working on zero net carbon building zoning right now. Some of you may be aware or involved in that process. And of course, the guidelines in the overlay. And the conceptual framework with much of these resilience strategies that the city is advancing as we're looking to promote resilience at different scales. So we have this sort of reinforcement of resilience throughout Boston. So, in our coastal areas, we've been looking at district scale interventions. Environment department's been great, leading a number of different projects in all of our waterfront neighborhoods, working with consultant teams and stakeholders as to what can be done along the shoreline to better prevent floodwaters from getting in. But we're also working at the site and building scale as well, which is where the guidelines and the zoning come into play. Early on in this process, some of the objectives that help frame the path forward. And looking at zoning, zoning in many ways is in place to protect for life safety and prevent property damage. Given we've got this new threat and hazard analysis through Climate Ready, really this need to update our codes and standards to be more responsive to this new reality. Also looking at our existing zoning codes to ensure we're not inhibiting resilient design and upgrades. I know with New York and post Sandy, there were a number of issues they had with their zoning with trying to allow for resilient upgrades to rebuild many areas of the city. So we try to avoid that. And also looking at specific zoning definitions, dimensional use standards that may need to be revised or created to facilitate resilience best practice. And with the guidelines, really to provide a resource that translates a lot of resilience strategies into sort of understandable best practices for construction as well as retrofits. Also having it very relatable to the Boston context. I know Fema has a fair amount of good resources for flood prevention, design, and measures, but they're very, I guess, say suburban in nature. So we wanted to ensure the guidelines are really responsive to the Boston building fabric, and also having a good tool that could be utilized and administered within the overlay. So in terms of process, we were able back in 2018 to get some grant funding through the state's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and their municipal vulnerability program to support this project. We hired a great consultant team comprising of Util, Kleinfelder, Noble, Wickersham, and Hart. I think it was very helpful to have the legal disciplines working with the design and architectural practitioners really to inform each other as we develop the zoning recommendations and the guidelines together. Early on, we had a lot of good conversations with a number of city departments and agencies that deal with the urban and public realm. So conversations with our Landmarks Commission, Disabilities Commission, as well as code enforcement and our Parks Department. We had a number of great focus groups, really bringing in practitioners in design and architectural realm, as well as members of the development community and legal land use, just to help inform the process. And then we had a number of great community forums out in the neighborhoods that are within this overlay, just to discuss vulnerability and just ensure that what was being developed through the guidelines was understandable. Legal team really dug into a lot of national and regional precedents and best practice that's out there with resilience regulations. Again, looked into potential conflicts with our existing code and relationships to Article 80, which is the development review component of our zoning. And through the design guidelines, looking at, again, a lot of best practice that's already out there, local, national level, and what FEMA has in place. And digging into again, the Boston context and Boston typologies. And just to walk through some of the primary components of the guidelines, we developed these resilient design principles, which are also referenced in the zoning, but looking at the guidelines as an organic document that we can update over time as new technologies and methodologies evolve. Thinking about the public realm, so if we are elevating, sites and finished floor elevations, thinking about how that interacts with and relates to existing open space and streetscapes. Also, relationship to these district scale or larger shoreline flood protection measures. And also thinking about co-benefits. So are there opportunities with retrofits or upgrades for mitigation of heat island, improving energy efficiency and meeting broader objectives of the city being carbon neutral by 2050. Within the guidelines, we've got a resilience toolkit. Really, this is what I think much of the guidelines is all about, just sort of framing these different types of strategies that can be implemented for different types of projects. The sections address building form, building envelope, issues like site access and adaptability, such as floodproofing measures, and also other supporting strategies that relate to landscaping and on-site energy. So with each of these, they include a fairly detailed description, as well as good information on technical design and cost considerations. And also developed a number of case studies, again, looked at some of the primary building typologies within these new flood extents, and then developed spreads looking at existing conditions with these building types, existing considerations, and really how these flood prevention measures can be implemented in an incremental fashion or more holistically with a complete rebuild. And the transition into the zoning, yes, some of this deck material is from some public meetings we had in January. So I know many of you are probably familiar with what zoning is or isn't, but just a brief overview that, again, the intent of code is to preserve health and ensure an orderly pattern of development. Also gets into these dimensional standards and use components. And also zoning really looking to implement, in most cases, broader planning and policy considerations. So in this case, a lot of this is, again, evolved out of Imagine Boston 2030 and Climate Ready Boston. And just, again, differentiating between zoning and building code getting into really the realm of materials and methods. And that code within Boston is administered by our Inspectional Services Department as well as zoning code. And overlays, again, these are sort of manifestations of our zoning that can cover a single or multiple of zoning districts or neighborhood districts and base zoning. Generally, overlays are more restrictive than the underlying zoning and advanced land use and design policies. And we do have a number of existing overlays within Boston related to issues such as groundwater conservation, green belts, urban agriculture. We should note we already have a flood hazard overlay under Article 25 of our code, but this is specific to the National Flood Insurance Program and FEMA's flood insurance rate maps. So these flood maps are represented by these purple areas you can see on this, this map on the image. These FEMA maps are developed based upon historic storms of record, so they do not incorporate sea level rise or future storm dynamics. So again, with these future flood extents that developed out of Climate Ready with the benefit of the Boston Harbor flood risk model, we think it's prudent to expand this sort of regulatory area and level of sort of higher flood protection standards to a broader spectrum based upon that modeling. And so just to walk through some of the primary components of the overlay, it's Article 25. Should note, over the past year, we've had the benefit of a legal or zoning consultant working with us to translate a lot of those recommendations into the actual draft language. But purpose and objectives, usually the first component of most all zoning articles, again, reiterating these design principles that are embodied within the guidelines. We should note that the guidelines are not incorporated into the zoning. They're there by reference. But we wanted to leave the guidelines outside of the zoning so we could update those in a more nimble fashion rather than having to go back to our zoning commission every time we want to tweak or update those guidelines. There's a definition section, and I think most of the definitions I'll be getting into in the coming slides here. With any zoning overlay, we need to have a map, so that'll be embodied in Appendix A. The areas of the overlay really will be extending to areas of the city, again, developed through the Boston Harbor flood risk model that we would expect to see seawater inundation with a major storm event, which is termed a 1% chance event. Fairly rare event, but we had two events in 2018, you may recall, in January and March, which came very close to that 1% threshold. And with the 2070 sea level rise dimension as well, we also have that built in. So 40 inches of sea level rise is a scale of sea level rise we anticipate somewhere between 2070 and 2100. So really well within the usable lifespan of most buildings that we are reviewing currently. There's a provision on interpretation of boundaries. So if a property owner has some question as to whether or not they are inside or outside of the zone, that would be determined by the Inspectional Services Department and the building commissioner, and that's consistent with Article 25. With regard to applicability and what projects will be subject to the overlay, we're going to be capturing all projects that are subject to Article 80, large and small project review. So again, Article 80 is a aspect of our zoning where projects are reviewed by the BPDA and have to go to our board for authorization. So the specific thresholds within Article 80, we are really embodying within the overlay. We determined that giving the existing review procedures under Article 80 that are well-defined, they're transparent, that would be the most efficient and effective way to implement the goals of the overlay rather than trying to develop new sort of thresholds or conventions. So any new project with comprising of 20,000 square feet or expansion of 20,000 square feet will be subject. We've got a tighter threshold of 10,000 square feet in our Harbor Park district. So these are areas of waterfront typically subject to the state's Tidelands Act, Chapter 91, in our downtown, Charlestown, South Boston, and Dorchester neighborhoods. And those Article 80 thresholds for additional units, change in use, and substantial rehabilitation, as you can see, would apply. There'd be exemptions for projects. So these are sort of standard grandfathering provisions that we have in other aspects of our code. So for a project that would to file for a building permit or for a variance with the Zoning Board of Appeal in advance of notice that we're going to the Zoning Commission for this overlay, those projects would be exempt. We also have a provision for election to comply. So if there's a project that is smaller than 20,000 square feet or does not fit within the mechanics of Article 80, proponent could undergo what we term resilience review, which I'll be getting into in a moment. With our existing zoning in relationship to existing zoning, so that being our base zoning and neighborhood zoning, the more restrictive provisions of the overlay would prevail. That's consistent as well with our planned development areas, which are sort of larger projects of an acre plus, which have more specific and refined zoning. Again, the more restrictive provisions of the overlay would rule the day, as well as those for institutional master plans. With respect to municipal harbor plans and designated port areas, these are really conventions of the state Tidelands Act, Chapter 91. So the state regulations would prevail over local zoning in that case. However, our harbor plans are developed locally. They need to be authorized by the state, and usually the state secretary requires that if we have any dimensional or use components of those harbor plans, we need to codify them in our zoning. So I don't foresee many conflicts between our harbor plan and the overlay provisions. So getting into use and dimensional regulations for essential facilities and high-risk structures. These are they types of uses are currently allowed within the overlay. They will become conditional to allow for a higher level of scrutiny with them. Typically, these types of uses are hospitals, shelters, those types of uses, and would be framed within Article or Appendix C of the code. We'll also be establishing a minimum sea level rise design flood elevation. So this would be the minimum elevation of the lowest occupied floor for residential uses, or what's termed a dry flood proofing elevation for non-residential uses. So dry flood proofing would be incorporating materials that would keep floodwaters out of a structure. We would also sort of dimensionally establish a sea level rise design flood elevation. This would comprise of sea level rise base flood elevation. So this would be the top of water elevation with that major storm event with 40 inches of sea level rise. We already have these elevations through our zoning viewer. We've got a sea level rise flood hazard map component of our zoning viewer. So you could actually point and click on an actual parcel and see if you're in or outside of this future flood zone and what the top of water elevation is. There is also another dimension of a freeboard or margin of safety, which is really FEMA best practice. And there'll be differing levels of freeboard based upon sort of use and to some extent location. So with FEMA velocity zones, so these are areas right along the inner harbor and shoreline where we can have higher wave action and wave heights of up to 3 feet. So a higher level of freeboard for those, as well as these more sensitive uses such as residential and the essential and high risk structures, and a 1 foot elevation of freeboard for other uses. There are limitations on use beneath that design flood elevation. Again, this is consistent with existing FEMA standards, but for residential, there'd be an allowance for stairs, ramps, lobbies, these sort of access and vertical circulation structures, flood prevention measures such as permanent or deployable flood barriers. Storage would be allowed, parking accessory to non-residential uses, and allowances for some temporary uses, typically retail or commercial in typology. For non-residential uses that are currently allowed, they would become conditional, again, to allow for a higher level of scrutiny of those uses beneath the flood elevation. And uses that are currently not allowed or conditional would remain forbidden. Building height would be defined differently within this overlay. Currently, building height is measured from at grade. So we've heard from property owners that have had an interest in elevating their site or building. They oftentimes run into zoning height dimensions. So within the overlay, building height will be measured from the higher of grade or the sea level rise base flood elevation plus 2 feet. And that would apply for both residential as well as non-residential. For larger sites where we have this dynamic potentially of in some areas grade being higher and other locations the BFE plus 2 being lower, we're allowing for height being measured from 5 feet above that base flood elevation. Some of the other dimensional components, we through this want to really be maintaining usable floor area and FARs. So there'd be exclusions for these stairs and ramp structures. So with the graphic you see in the upper right-hand corner from our guidelines, these areas in pink would not be considered part of the floor area calculation, as well as space needed for those flood prevention measures. And similarly for open space and lot coverage, exclusion for those vertical circulation structures, as well as if we need some type of structure for elevation of mechanical and sensitive utilities to ensure those are up and above that flood elevation. Some of the other dimensional components for front, rear, side yards. Again, allowances for those stairs and ramps if they need to be external to a building. With rear and side yards, also an allowance for those elevated mechanicals. And in situations where we may have very sort of tight dimension of a building frontage right up on um, a sidewalk or a streetway, allowance for a primary entrance to be on a side yard or side street. And lastly, resilience review. So as part of the Article 80 large and small project review, there'd be a new component for resilience. So currently, projects that are undergoing our review need to address impacts on things like transportation, environmental impacts, wind, shadow. So there'd be another new component related to resilience that would integrate the design guidelines and those design principles. Just to note, we're going to be posting a position soon for a resilient review design staffer to conduct this. So those out, the view out there with architectural and design backgrounds that may want to get more involved with this, we should be posting that within the next month or so. Also, again, a number of appendices that I think we covered relating to the overlay map and definitions. And we will also be doing some tweaks to some of the existing zoning articles. So those special purpose overlay district provisions would be updated for the resilience overlay. And again, modifications to Article 80 for the resilient review component. And in terms of process, yeah, we put the draft material out in, I think it was mid-December. We held a couple of very well attended public meetings in January and are looking to receive comment by this Friday, February 12th. We'll be reviewing those comments and questions, making any necessary updates to the overlay, and then having a final version posted. Beyond that, we would have to go to our board to request authorization to go to the zoning commission, and then as soon as a month after the board meeting, we could be before the zoning commission to promulgate the overlay. So I think that about covers it from my end. I will stop the share and I guess open it up for any questions, comments, thoughts people may have.
Thank you, Chris. Very helpful. I People can probably also raise their hands, and I can ask them to unmute themselves. We have Michelle, who has posted 2 questions in the chat. Michelle, do you want to go just ask your question and mute yourself?
Well, technically no, because I'm eating, but yeah, when you were talking about the flood barriers, I just wondered, and maybe I missed it, but if you include those sorts of barriers, are you liberated in the use for that lower level? I don't know if I've put that very well, but
yeah, I think, you know, we're trying to be consistent with FEMA here. So in many cases, those deployable barriers are not considered sort of permanent or static flood prevention measures. They're usually, you know, put out there just in advance of a coastal storm event.
right.
So I think it's only where, you know, for the commercial non-residential uses that are dry floodproofing up to that elevation, there's an allowance for different types of uses beneath that elevation. But if it's a residential use or multifamily, even with that deployable, there would not be allowed uses for, say, bedrooms or those types of uses beneath that elevation.
Okay. And the other question I had thrown in here was how much the utility companies were involved in this, or are they obviously they're kind of their own thing, but just curious.
Yeah, we've not had them directly involved in the development of the guidelines or the zoning, but that's a very good point. We've had them engaged and involved with a lot of the district scale work, the sort of larger flood resilient initiatives that get into potentially elevating rights of way and things of that nature, but that's a very good point.
They're often difficult to work with, so I was just curious if you had engaged with them at a sort of as a bigger entity.
Yeah, we've not engaged yet, you
Yeah.
know, Keyspan or Eversource or any of those others. I mean, we've had, these flood elevations as part of our conversations with project proponents that are undergoing the Article 80 process. Currently, it's something that's part of our resilience checklist. So, through the development review process over the past couple of years where we've had these elevations in place, we've not seen or heard much in the way of friction from utilities on that. It may become more of an issue, if we advance this to a point where we've got certain requirements for, single family, 3 families, sort of the smaller projects that typically don't fit within our current sort of review thresholds, below Article 80. But I think when we look to get into that, that's going to be an important conversation.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Looks like we have another question from Steve with CBT. Steve, did you want to ask yours?
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation, Chris. I just want to expand on Michelle's question a little bit. So a lot of developers for multifamily projects have subgrade parking for residential use. At the ground plane, if all of your entryways and the entry to the garage is above the design flood elevation, could you have parking, residential parking?
Yeah, I think we need to, clarify that. I think if it's, residential parking that's at grade that happens to be below that design flood elevation, that's okay. I think we want to clarify that with Inspectional Services Department and potentially with the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program representative more locally. I know FEMA's taken far more of a hard line on any residential parking below grade. And that could be a real issue with some projects currently that are looking for permitting. But I'm thinking if it's at grade, not subgrade for residential use, I'm thinking that should be okay. And we need to, I think, clarify that in the language.
Okay, but for subgrade parking, you're thinking that would not be allowed, or is that something
I
you're
know
looking at?
The FEMA, currently that's a real issue. And that's something that should not be happening. Again, with much of this, we're trying to be consistent with those FEMA standards. But we're, dealing with a much broader geography with this overlay. So I think that, based upon the comment we received back, we'll have to give that some thought.
Okay. And actually, I have a second question. Maybe I missed it during the presentation. The map that's included with Appendix A, is that already built into the BPDA zoning viewer map?
Yeah. So, the most, I guess, accurate map currently is the zoning viewer map. So we had Woods Hole Group that developed the Boston Harbor flood risk model, provide us with the data to build into that layer of those top of water elevations and those flood extents. So that will be functionally the overlay. I know the mapping that was done through Climate Ready is very similar to that, but it also integrated a lot of Water and Sewer Commission data and sort of created a number of simplifying assumptions from a mapping standpoint. So I know that within Climate Ready, there's a very clear statement that states, if you're utilizing, if you should be utilizing the Boston Harbor flood risk model for further planning and policy purposes. So we've gone directly back to that resource for purpose of development of the overlay map.
Okay, thanks very much.
And I have added a link to that zoning viewer in the chat for everyone's reference.
We have another question from Michael. Michael, did you want to ask your question? We're also happy to read it.
Sure, yeah, I just unmute. So I'm not sure if this is maybe a bit too specific, but having done a project recently that involved this question when we knew about the coming of requirements and we were anticipating that for a hotel, and we were starting to think about designing these slide-in freeboards, as you I think call them, where an event is happening, potentially a king tide or storm surge in an area that's noted in the maps. Um, what happens with egress and the fire department and maybe even ADA requirements during such an event? Is there a door that's allowed for a emergency person to get over those devices to evacuate people?
So you're speaking of the those deployable flood barriers?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding from fire and through the Public Improvement Commission that typically needs to authorize those is that once that barrier is deployed and in place, everyone needs to be out of the building. So, typically, in prior storms, some of these properties that have them in place, I think like Atlantic Wharf and State Street, they set up, 90% of the barrier. And then when they know the floodwater's coming, they get everyone else out of the building and then finish the barrier off. But that's my understanding through fire code is that you cannot have a building occupied with those barriers in place because fire cannot get into the structure.
Has the Boston Fire Department been involved with this draft?
Not specifically this draft. Again, we have allowances for space for these types of systems, so it's not counting against usable square footage. But I know fire department sits on the Public Improvement Commission, and it has a role with sort of authorizations for these deployable systems when they're in the public way. So I know, 255 State Street, which I think is a Pembroke property, came forth with a fairly substantial sort of protocol for deployment of deployable systems, and fire department was out there to evaluate just a test run of deployment of that system, and they're on sort of this contact list that needs to be referenced before that system is put in place.
Okay, thank you.
And McKinnon has a hand up. Anne, would you like to ask your question?
And looks like you're unmuted, but we can't hear you still. Okay, Anne is writing it.
Well, Anne's writing that up. I've got a question, Chris. So you noted the dimensional requirement changes such as modified building height measurements and floor area exceptions. I wondered if that was intended to acknowledge the potential loss of FAR or floor area with retrofits. Was that a mechanism to encourage additional floor area or additional floors?
Not necessarily additional floors. I think, with the stairs and ramps, we're just dealing with, these access structures that, don't comprise, a whole floor, but if they have to be brought into a building, we don't want to have that, affect usable square footage. So, I don't know if that, would be a size or dimension that would allow for additional floor. I don't think we really got into that calculation or assessment of those types of exceptions and whether or not they would, facilitate an additional usable floor. But again, we're in terms of these design flood elevations, I think in most cases it's, potentially 2, somewhere it could be 6 feet. So I don't think we're getting a whole nother floor out of that. I think, again, if we're going to apply this to smaller properties, that may need to be a consideration again, with street wall continuity and sort of design and sort of urban fabric and neighborhoods, to go 5 feet up, on this elevation with a blank wall, that's something we don't want. Should we consider just going an additional story there? Where you could have, potentially parking on that grade or floor elevation, rather than having this 4 or 5 foot awkward space. But yeah, the FAR in terms of an additional story was not really contemplated with those allowances.
Thank you.
I'll just read Anne's question. So she wrote that there are many federal and state property owner on the waterfront. What is BPDA's general approach to working with them to engage them and get them to follow the guidelines when they aren't required to do so?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, as you know, yeah, this federal state properties are not subject to our local zoning. But we have, I know, have had GSA very engaged and interested in resilience work. And we've, had discussions with, staff over at the Moakley Courthouse, currently with Hook Lobster, which is right on the waterfront, right across from the Coast Guard, another GSA asset, discussing sort of resilient alignments with them. So, where we do have the opportunity to engage them, we do that. And I think state property, state assets, similarly with, organizations like Massport, which has their own guidelines for sort of elevation standards, which I think even in most cases are even greater than what we're asking for. So, I can't necessarily speak to, how all these state agencies, DCR, DCAM, Massport are all coordinating or not coordinating, but we definitely have these conversations with them. The T as well, when they have infrastructure enhancements, they more recently did a lot to reinforce the Blue Line station at Aquarium, and a number of conversations we had with them, as well as our Public Works Department on those types of structures and upgrades that they were doing. So I think there's most definitely interest by those parties, and where we do have the opportunity through projects or planning, we are engaging them.
Edward has a question, but just to piggyback on the previous comment about integration with Massport. So do you anticipate that the design review process of the Article 80 and the review process with the BCDC will also have some sort of an impact with the new zoning and with the new regulation, in addition to the BPDA new staff reviewer that you will hire?
No, I think, in many cases, a lot, once these standards are out there, I think project proponents are, as they kind of already are, sort of building these types of flood proofing measures and best practices into their projects. So when it gets to, BCDC review or our review, they're in many ways already a part of the program, in terms of, again, those elevations where they're putting the mechanical systems, other deployable measures. So I think it'll be helpful, again, to have that staff individual on point, that has a higher degree of technical understanding of what makes most sense, and just ensuring that there's responsiveness to the design guideline principles. But, I presented to the BCDC on this, so they're aware and very supportive of this type of thing, and understand the importance of resilience. But that's not to say there may be, urban design challenges, where you're dealing with different grades and access issues, how that impacts, how those active street functions, access to ground floor uses. So, I think it'd be helpful to have that design staff are on point to assist with those types of issues as they come up.
Edward, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, does the BPDA collaborate with surrounding jurisdictions like Chelsea, Revere, or Quincy to recommend or implement these changes to their zoning guidelines. I know that some of the neighboring districts may not have as much resources as the PPDA to do this, but just wondering if there's some kind of ongoing dialogue with these other neighbors.
Yeah, I think I have more of a relationship with cities like Cambridge and Somerville, so there has been some cross conversations with respect to zoning and the type of zoning that's going on. We're always available if questions or issues come up. There's not necessarily a regular dialogue, amongst all the various communities. I know the mayor, has had the Metro Mayor's Climate Coalition, which gets into a number of different issues and topics, usually more broader, like, the carbon neutral objectives and other things like housing. But I think, Boston as a city, I think we need to do more regionally in working with those neighborhood communities. I know that there are, area nonprofits like Mystic River Watershed Association that's done a lot to build collaborative efforts among communities within the watershed on resilience and stormwater. The zoning, it's very, and sort of our purview is very much sort of project and site specific, and working with, city's environment department on advancing these broader resilience projects and initiatives. But I think, it'd be very helpful to work with those neighboring communities. And I know with, again, the coastal resilience solutions work that's currently going on, looking at areas of East Boston. I think there's been some engagement with Revere, given sort of flood pathways and connectivity there with inundation for that type of work, but not so much on the sort of smaller scale site building scale stuff we've been doing.
And Michelle had a good follow-up. Michelle, did you want to unmute to build on Edward's question?
You guys don't like reading them, huh?
We love to read it. Yeah, especially if it's a regional, if it's a regional issue. You want me to read it?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
But I was thinking the same thing that Edward had posted, but to that end, I mean, is FEMA like encouraging? I would think it would be in their best interest to like try to get as many municipalities on board thinking this way as possible. Are they, using you as a great test case and trying to spread the word, or like, I don't know, something?
Yeah, I'm not to my knowledge. I know we have been meeting with FEMA over the past year and a half, 2 years. Again, part of Climate Ready is we're trying to improve our, I guess it's termed community rating with FEMA, through the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program. Properties that are within those FEMA flood zones receive subsidized flood insurance, where the sort of commercial insurance industry won't provide any insurance at all for flooding. So we are trying to improve our rating to even reduce those rates further for residents within Boston. And so they look very favorably upon this overlay and the sort of higher level and higher standard. But I'm not aware of FEMA staff promoting this work more broadly, as far as I know.
That's a really good question. For those of you who aren't familiar with FEMA BRIC, I'm just going to pop that in the chat here. There's been a lot of talk around that. It's building resilient infrastructure in communities. A lot of talk about it. We'll see what happens, but it basically leverages 6% of federally declared disaster funds to mitigation, to pre-disaster mitigation. And part of that is for building codes specifically. I can't remember if it's for zoning, but that's a great example of where they could sharpen that tool.
Yeah.
So really good question.
Yeah, we, through the development of the zoning recommendations and guidelines, that's, again, state grant funded projects. So we, provide the state with all the materials and all the documentation, so those can be shared more broadly to the MVP community throughout the Commonwealth. but I'm not clear on how the MVP program at the state level disseminates that information.
Anne has her hand up. And can you unmute, or if you want to type it into the chat if you're not able to unmute?
I think perhaps it was from the earlier question.
Okay.
One follow-up to this was also, Chris, that has, so for example, I'm just looking at the zoning viewer in the South End district, or there are a lot of other sort of historic smaller sub-neighborhoods that are under the overlay now. Have you received any comments or feedback from, how do you manage these competing priorities where you want to preserve some of the historic built fabric versus climate resiliency? I know that you identified the triple decker typology, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've had, some conversations with Landmarks Commission on this and presented to, I know, a couple of the district commissions, and they're all very supportive, of this work. Clearly, and I think as part of the Article 80 process, I think particularly with small project review, Landmarks is integrated into that. But I think that's, again, a lot of the projects we're reviewing through Article 80 are sort of larger new projects, so they typically don't get into these historic assets and existing assets that are out there in these more dense historic districts. But I think it's going to likely be sort of the next phase of this if we're getting into promoting these types of best practices for your smaller projects, your single family, your townhouses, your 3-family, and these historic assets, how and what's viable in the way of flood protection measures with those buildings to ensure they're around for another, 150, 200 years.
There's one question we missed from Tarika at CBT. What has the feedback been like so far from the public comment period? Have there been any notable areas of change or further development that have been suggested?
No, I think there's been some concern from, some of the larger development concerns out there with these planned development areas, where there's a lot of specificity that's hammered out within the planned development area agreements, that they're sort of going with for these larger projects that, could extend based upon phasing 5, 15 years. A lot of what we have in the overlay, though, is already kind of built in to a lot of these PDA agreements, with most all of them that go through our process. It's typically referenced that project phases need to be responsive to whatever climate resilience policy programs, regulations we have in place at the time of that phase coming along. So we need to dig in a little more as to what the specific concerns are there. I think there's also been some legitimate questions, concerns with uses that are currently allowed beneath the design flood elevation that become conditional. So that sort of trips the trigger of having to go to the Zoning Board of Appeal, which does take time. But again, we want to, I think the intent is to have that level of resilience review with these changes in uses or uses beneath that design flood elevation, just to, have that conversation to ensure, best practices are being considered, if not deployed. So there may be another mechanism that may be less onerous for that. But I think that's the other point that was raised.
I had a question, but I also wanted to give a shout out. I think in terms of the work BPDA has done is considerable. And, in terms of the tools, the zoning viewer, the guides are very accessible. So, if there's a developer out there that hasn't heard of climate impacts, they must be totally asleep, right? So you've armed them with a lot of great tools. I'm wondering, kind of following up on the last question, how you're kicking the tires. So you'll get some feedback. Some projects will be rolling in, how will you kind of incorporate some of the, where the rubber hits the road in terms of how things are working out and how to adjust?
Yeah, well, again, a lot of what we are sort of formalizing through the overlay is sort of been out there for a while with the resilience checklist that we currently have for development review. And, we oftentimes before there's any filing that comes into the BPDA, there are a number of conversations, we may have with the developer or proponent, and looking into things like resilience and, affordable housing and public realm impacts. So a lot of this has been socialized more broadly. I mean, once the zoning is in place, it's not the most flexible thing to be updating. So again, we're sort of taking the comments and questions that come in, very seriously, and we'll definitely review those. But I think we've got, since Climate Ready came out, a lot of best practice that's out there. Again, I think it's just going to be more challenging with, the smaller properties that comprise majority of, the built form that's within this overlay, and how we handle retrofits and upgrades, to those properties, given, the cost considerations, the existing conditions of those properties, affordability, and issues that may come up with respect to, increased value and taxation. So there's a lot of things we need to think through. I think at the very least, through the provision we have for proponents to elect to comply with resilience review, and having these dimensional components in place, I think we afford property owners to take advantage of that. So in the unfortunate event we do have something like a Sandy type flood in Boston, we want to ensure that we can facilitate, best practice in these types of resilient design measures with rebuilds or retrofits after that type of event.
I just wanted to also take the opportunity to remind attendees, thanks for your questions. We're not saying we want to stop that necessarily right now, but if you do want to contact directly to give feedback, that comment deadline is February 12th. I assume that's the end of the day. And Devanshi has just put in a link to do that. So please be sure and do that. Any other questions, or do people want to head to dinner early? We're certainly happy to keep going.
I'm going to also post the link to the Committee on Resilient Environments page on BSA. If you're interested in getting involved, or if you want to go back and look at this recording again and find some of the answers that Chris mentioned, you're able to do it, and also you can sign up for future updates from us as well. Steve did have a comment. Is the copy of the presentation available? Chris, if it is possible, we can post it on the BSA website too.
Yeah, I know through the project webpage, we've got the draft language, a summary of the draft, the PowerPoint that I just went through. I think it's the same that we did for the public meetings, as well as questions and answers from those public meetings. So there's a lot there through the project webpage. So if you just look up, resilient zoning and design guidelines, the BPDA, there's most all of that there.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that's the link that I sent again. I've also sent the link to the PDF, but I'll at least post all of these links on our BSA website too. So it would, everyone who signed up will get a notification about it.
Great.
Any last thoughts from anyone?
No, it was an excellent presentation. I do thank you for, as Dave said, the amount of work and good work and thought that you've put into it. It's great.
Thanks. Yeah, it's team effort. Yeah, there are a lot of folks that are working on this from our zoning legal team. A lot of input from our inspectional services department and urban design team and whatnot. So definitely a lot of thought has gone into it, but you know, definitely through this comment period, you know, the intent is if we've missed anything or, you know, something we haven't considered, definitely open for, you know, people's thoughts and questions for sure.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Devanshi.
everyone, for
Thanks, Dave.
joining. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Joe.
your time.
Thank you.
And
Thanks so
Chris,
much,
thank you so
everyone.
much for your time and effort and joining us today.
Great.
Yeah, we really appreciate that.
Yeah, if any further questions, yeah, people can reach out to me directly as well. So I've been, yeah, fielding a number of questions this whole week, given the comment deadlines Friday. So
I
I'm
can
sure.
imagine that's been a busy week. Thanks
Yeah.
for all the hard work and thanks for speaking to us.
great. Thanks for having me in.
All right.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
week, everybody.
All right.
Thank
See you
you.
guys.
Bye.